Thank you so much for coming out tonight on this beautiful evening for our kickoff event for the opening of Lineages, Artists Are Never Alone. I'm joined on stage tonight by 5 of the 11 exhibiting artists of Judith Seligson, Suzette Marie Martin, B. Amore, Terry Van Dyson, and Michael Abrams. And a huge thank you to each of you for coming out tonight in advance of the opening tomorrow to participate in this conversation. I'd also like to thank our media sponsor, GNAT-TV, who is filming tonight's program and will be distributing the program through their channels. We're very grateful for your support. And also a huge thank you to Anthony Surratt, who's back there in that dark corner waving his hand. Anthony has been my co-curator and collaborator on this project. Has been just a tremendous joy to work with, so insightful, and has just made this project really deep and rewarding pleasure. So thank you, Anthony, for everything you've done to make it happen. Before we dive into the conversation, I did ask each of the artists to prepare a brief introduction. So I'll turn this over to them to say their hellos. And artists, I'm gonna throw this out there. I hope it doesn't rattle you too much, but I was hoping as part of your introduction, if you could just share the first word that comes to mind when you hear the phrase, my creative lineage. And whoever feels ready to go first can jump right in.
My creative image?
Along with your introduction.
Do you want just the word, or you want us to do our introduction at the same time?
That's right, thank you.
Like throwing a wrench in the works.
You know, funny, when you said Italy is what came to mind, which is very, very interesting. My name is B. Amore. If you haven't picked up on it, that's Italian-American. And I'm an artist and a writer. And I founded the Carving Studio and Sculpture Center in West Rutland, Vermont, which is going to be 39, I think, this coming year. I founded it in 1987, so I'm not really quite sure of the math. But, yeah. Okay, that's enough, right?
Michael Abrams, and my work is about atmosphere, but it's also about, I would say, a community of artists, and artists from history, artists from the contemporary scene. And a big part of what I do is in my work is to embrace nature, the qualities of nature that I see here in Vermont. After spending about 30 years in New York, I've been in Vermont for about 16 years. And that and this community of artists here that I've grown to know has been probably the biggest influence on my work to date.
Hello, my name is Suzette Marie Martin, and I'm a mixed media painter based here in New England. And my work bears witness to ecological trauma. I do this through combining elements from nature mythologies and other historic resources with 21st century climate and environmental science data in the form of handwritten text and charts and graphs and other symbols. I don't have a single word, I have 2 words. One would be emotion and the other would be rationality. So by combining imagery that has emotional value with the rationality of science, I'm trying to create that sort of push-pull balance in my artwork.
I'll try this. Does this work? Yes, it does. I'm Terry Van Dyson, and I'm an architect and an artist. I can say this. And my influences are, my mother's an artist in her own right, and my father is a land sculptor, an apple orchard grower. And they both know how to collect stuff and fix it and make it anew. So that's a lot of my inspiration from them. But it's also the materials that tell me what to do. And there's a couple other sayings that sort of drive my thoughts, which is never accept whatever is right. And the other one, I have to look at my notes, how clever. Capturing the essence of the thing, not the thing itself. And those are the things that I'm influenced by. The creative image is a stone for me.
Judith Seligson, artist living in New York City and Alexandria, Virginia. I wanted to quote Picasso, "Why do two colors placed one next to each other sing?" And he answers himself, "Does anybody know why?" And he says, "No." And that's my life. I think juxtaposition, it captures many things: quotation, juxtaposition, and color, which is a mystery, and remains that for, it's just an exploration into that. Do you want one word or two? No, I didn't. 2 words, 1 word, to be interval.
Thank you all. So just to recap for the audience, I think from Michael, we had community. From Terry, stone. From B, Italy. From Suzette, emotion and rationality. And from Judith, interval. So we'll get back to those ideas and peel back the layers a little bit more. But thank you all for starting us there. And I thought it would be helpful just to give a little context for how this exhibition came about. It started a little over a year ago, last summer, 2023, and Anthony and I and Ann Corso, the former executive director of SVAC, were getting together for a fun lunch. We were celebrating Anthony's recent completion of his MFA from Maine College of Art and Design. And over lunch, Anthony was telling us about his thesis project and how he had deeply researched the life and legacy of the iconic abstract artist Robert Rauschenberg, and how that process of kind of digging into that research was really quite revelatory for him, to have that time and space to consider Rauschenberg's influence on his work. And that's where the seed for this project began to germinate, and we started to trade ideas about what we could do. At first, we envisioned a series of programming. We thought we would invite a range of artists to come speak about their artistic influences, and then our eyes got big. The idealistic phase of the project came in. We started envisioning an exhibition where we could pair the work of the artists with the original work by the historically significant artists that inspired them. And then we had to backpedal. We realized, getting some of those loans might have been difficult for us here. But really, those two basic concepts of programming and exhibition merged together, and we came up with a plan to organize a thematically driven exhibition focused on telling the sometimes invisible stories of influence behind different artists' work. And we knew we wanted to activate those stories with artist talks and other live programming throughout the run of the exhibition. Over time, the concept evolved a little bit more, and I'll speak to that in a few minutes. But first, I'm going to turn back to our panelists, if they're ready. And I would be curious if you could each comment on just what it's been like to be part of this exhibition so far. What the process has been like for you. Has it been different from other exhibitions, other group shows you've been a part of? Has there been something that's felt revealing or rewarding about participating in the Lineages project?
Being able to do something that is outside of the box is really important for me, and I was thrilled when I was invited to do this, and I'm kind of honored because I really like this this art center, and I've shown in some group shows before, and it's nice to be here again. But to participate in something in such a large scale with other artists and who are just quite good is a thrill. And they're all very, very diverse, which is I liked a lot. It's not a show of being a landscape painter. I often get put in shows with lots of landscapes, and this is kind of interesting because your work is on its own unique, but the story behind the show is the glue, not the theme of the artworks or whatever.
Well said. It's been a number of my pieces are on. I've borrowed from the private collections of people who have collected my work, and they were created during a time when I was really prolific. I'm working full time, so it's a little more challenging. But being part of this show, and to your point, Michael, to be part of this group, I've never participated in anything like this, so it's really exciting. And it was great to finally produce a piece of work new within the last week. It's been years, so I'm honored to have that opportunity to be a part of all this. And the story definitely matters a lot.
Well, it's been a pretty interesting experience. I mean, and I've been around the art world in many different ways, as a reviewer, as an artist, as a public artist, internationally and all. So there was a great deal of dialogue, with you and Anthony, which was unusual. Even from the beginning, I mean, I had never done anything like a Zoom review of things in my studio. And so going around, with my computer or iPhone, I can't remember which I used, and looking at pieces, and then Anthony and Allison getting back with the pieces that they chose, which was a variety of pieces from different periods in my life. And unfortunately, because of distance and expense, we didn't include any of my stone sculptures, which are sizable. But I also have a very a large spot of affection for Southern Vermont Arts Center. I mean, I've done a number of reviews here, and I've been to I don't know how many shows. And I just think it's a really special place in terms of the way it conceives things, the way it presents, the way it invites community in. I mean, it's to me, it's like a model. I have goosebumps talking about it. I mean, I just really love it and love everything that you've done, Allison and Anne. Sorry Anne is gone. But yeah, I have a very deep connection with you. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
For me, participating in this show was a chance to really think about the lineages in my own artwork. I mean, I have been aware of what influences me, but to really think very clearly and precisely about what is it that I can see as a thread amongst not just the work that's in this show, but the work that I've been doing my whole life. And it was interesting for me to try and boil it down to, maybe the top two things that have influenced me. So this has been a really wonderful way for myself to analyze what it is that I'm doing in the studio and why I'm doing it. And the other thing is being paired with all of the other artists that are in this exhibition, which are very, very diverse and completely different from the work that I do. I really love that all of us are acknowledging the fact that we don't work in a vacuum, that we do have very strong influences, whether they're from our personal experience or our cultural upbringing or our interest in particular times in art history. So it's a really wonderful chance to connect with a group of artists that I might not have otherwise met.
It's been a great experience. I'm very impressed with both Anthony and Allison, and synthesizing things and coming up with titles and, deadlines and questions. We're 11 people here. That's a lot. And funneling all of that into something that has turned into this is very impressive, I think. I also think it shows, learning about all of you and the other artists, I see how many things we have in common. And color, juxtaposition, found objects. Some of my work is very different from painting, and it really follows. So it tells me what the heartbeat of this maybe much larger artist today is. I also remembered how much Vermont was important to me. I mean, I lived here, I painted here, I showed here in the early 1980s. And that was, my love of nature and the way nature is in my paintings is certainly part of my experience in Vermont.
Thank you. Those were such great answers, and there's a lot there that I want to pull on a little bit more. These points around like connection across differences, something I want us to talk a little bit more about. The multiplicity of influences behind a single artist's work, I want to get into a little bit more. And I think I'll segue just talking about an evolution in our own concept for the show. When we started off, we were really thinking a bit more narrowly about art historical lineages, making connections between the contemporary exhibiting artists and typically artists from the past who had influenced their work. And that is very foundational to the story still. But Bea mentioned our virtual studio visits. Anthony and I set up a studio visit via Zoom with each of the artists. It's been about an hour, got tours of their studios, got up close to some of their work, and it was our first kind of get to know you conversations. And we came away from 11 conversations sort of realizing that this exhibition would be incomplete if we didn't also make space for this whole diversity of influences behind artists' work. So people have given a few examples, but some artists are drawing from disciplines beyond the visual arts, science, theology, music, poetry. We have some artists who are really diving into their ancestral and cultural histories and heritages, often bringing in stories with themes of loss and resilience into their work. We have artists looking to other art forms for inspiration, carpet weaving, mask making, crochet. And some artists are really considering the significance of place, our relationship with the natural world, the ways in which that relationship is shifting in recent decades. So, I mean, there's a real diversity of inspirational forces at play in the gallery, and that's really been one of the most rewarding parts of the project for me personally. So with that kind of expansive understanding of creative lineages in mind, could you each please talk about one or more of your lineages and connect it to process, to the making of your work? Because, I think what's fascinating, hopefully what will be fascinating for visitors, is that these influences are not always readily apparent. They're not always visually apparent in the artwork. So I'm curious if in some instances your connection with your lineage is more process-based rather than more of an aesthetic outcome you're looking to achieve.
So it's interesting for me, when you asked the first question and Italy came to mind. It's not that it was like a conscious choice. I mean, I grew up in an Italian-American family that was very tuned to the arts and opera. You know, my mother had actually graduated from art school in the 30s, which was very unusual for a daughter of immigrants, in fashion design. And, you know, she taught me to see. She brought me to museums when I was a child. My favorite museum in Boston was Mrs. Jack Gardner's Palace. And, you know, I used to go by myself on Saturdays and bring my girlfriends with me. I mean, that was my play place. You know, it was absolutely wonderful. So art was just a part of what I grew up with. I never had any formal education in art. I really credit my mother with being my first and major teacher, really. And she also worked at the International Institute with many refugees after the Second World War. So I grew up in a sea of immigrants and very aware of, you know, a lot of painful stories. So the theme of immigration has also entered my work, but not at the beginning. You know, I ended up actually majoring in sociology at BU and going into social work because I felt that art was selfish, even though if I had a child like myself who was always drawing, painting, and carving, even carving when I was a child, I would have like pushed her into art school. But anyway, eventually I got back to my true self in my early 30s. I was already the mother of 2 children, about to be a mother of a 3rd, and then soon, a couple of years after, a single parent. So it was not an easy life because I had to always work. And I started carving in wood and then carving in stone, and it was like an incredible passion for me. Then eventually I started to want to put the stone together with something else, and I met Mark DeSuvero in California when I was living there, and he took me on top of one of his huge sculptures in the crane, and I was like astonished, and I was steel. I had to put my stone and steel together. And at that time I was going back and forth to Carrara. I had a Fulbright grant and studied there for a year. And in Italy, there was, you can't put stone and steel together. And I said, well, why not? You know what I mean? So I started putting these pieces together in the studio where I was working, Nicoli's in Carrara. And after a few months, you know, I speak Italian fluently, the head of the foreman of the shop started to bring people by. I said, look at what this woman is doing. It's kind of interesting, you know what I mean? Even though and I had gone to the junkyards to pick up pieces of steel to put, you know, with the stone. And eventually, I mean, mostly what you'll see here is a lot of mixed media objects, because it's very interesting. I remember when I started carving, I started looking around. My world changed. I started to think about shapes and forms in an incredibly different way. And Brancusi and Hepworth were my early, very early influences. And I don't know, I have a love of objects. You know, I grew up in a house filled with objects. My grandmother saved everything. And so I started to add things to the steel, and I started to make things that had a lot of different parts to them, which you will see. And I ended up finding gloves on the sidewalk in New York. I still have the first one I found. I should have brought it, that would have been fun. It was a Con Ed glove, and it had the name Magid on it, M-A-G-I-D. So they gave out these gloves, and they put the guy's name, mostly guys, I guess, you know, name on the glove. And I started using these fabric stiffeners to stiffen them, and then, well, I cast one in bronze, but it was too expensive to think about doing that continuously. So I started looking for ways to harden them, and then I used bronze powder and this hardener at the end, so they looked like bronze. Most people will pick them up and think they're bronze, and then sometimes I just paint them. So I've done absolutely large pieces. I have a huge piece at Tufts Medical Center that I finished a few years ago called The Arc of Healing Hands, that really is a tribute to the people who work there. And it was a way to integrate people. You know, I feel like we're one human family. All the works with immigration. I did this big show at Ellis Island. Forgot to bring the book with me, An Italian-American Odyssey, and Lifeline, Filo della Vita, The Thread of Life. And it traced my family as the characters in a century of immigration from 1901 to 2001. It took 6 rooms of work at Ellis Island. And then I started, you know, eventually working with these gloves where I could work with communities. You know, with the Tufts community, I collected gloves from the patients, from the nurses, the doctors, do you know what I mean? And made this, really extremely beautiful ark. So I'd say that's the essence, and I love everything. I mean, people don't like walking around city streets with me because I'm just picking things up all the time. I remember once being on 2nd Avenue with my youngest daughter, Tiffany, and I saw this piece of newspaper that was crumpled, and it was sort of in the gutter, and it had rained. And I went to pick it up. She said, "Ma, you'll get run over by a bus." I said, "No, I'll be okay." And I picked it up. And I usually would get the Village Voice, and I would tuck things in the pages of the Village Voice so they would dry out in my hotel room. So you'll see. I mean, I just love people and love the world, and that comes through in the work, I think. You'll see Glove Globe, which, I mean, I didn't have a name for it when I started to make it. I was making this rounded piece with all these different gloves, and I realized it was like a portrait of us in the world. And you'll see Canterbury pilgrims with this procession of gloves. Of course, when I showed it in New York, they would say, this is very funny. In New York, they're saying, "So is this the wife of Bath?" Only in New York, they would be going for the characters. I said, no, it's not quite that literal, but it's us. We're all on this journey in life, and we have much more in common than we have apart. And it's my way of contributing, to the conversation that's always happening. As you know, there are always ways that people want to exclude, and there's in-groups and out-groups, and I've always hated that in art. It's what I love about your institution, is that it's very embracing. And the work is about that. It's about all of us. So thank you. I hope that helped.
Well, sort of the artistic lineages behind my work. I was an art history major in college, and I took painting courses and sculpture courses, and I would, appropriate everything. I was a neoclassical painter, and then I was, an impressionist, and then, I did cubism. I did all these things, and that had a really big effect on my work, even now, because I don't mind appropriating the qualities of art from history with ease. I think that's important that we take from that, take what we like, and it is subject matter as anything else. My work, when I moved to New York, I became a sculptor. I just started sculpting these brightly colored three-dimensional objects and out of all sorts of materials, paper and wood and balsa wood. And I was making little sculptures. I arrived in New York and stayed at the Times Square Motor Hotel and made tiny little sculptures in balsa wood and paint. And that was really fun, and I still have some of those. But later, in the 90s, I became much more serious about making paintings themselves instead of sculpture or objects or art furniture. And I started to explore the invented depth or just the invented space of painting. I had a lot of early influences, and I've always remained kind of a landscape painter, but some early influences were let's say Mark Rothko, because I like the plainness of it. It's one color, it says so much with so little, and I still attempt to kind of mix a literal landscape painting and have it form into some kind of color field where things blend together and you might get an overall hue or an overall feel from it, or a sensation of color. And after I moved to Vermont, and my work became less minimal, less studio-oriented, and less series-oriented. And I started putting lots more trees and nature in my work. And I once again fell in love with the painters of the late romantic period, let's say the Hudson River School painters, Frederick Church and Thomas Cole and Asher B. Durand, and because they embraced nature in sort of a sort of a small s spiritual kind of way. And I was doing that here in Vermont, and really slowly absorbed the qualities of nature here, living in the Green Mountains, the seasons constantly changing, things living and dying, all the animals, but mostly just sort of enjoying the atmosphere of it, the totality of it, and trying to imbue my paintings with some of that quality. And so now they've become a kind of iconic, romantic painting. And more lately, as in a show a few years ago at the Brattleboro Museum, I was able to sort of pile the paintings on each other, put them against each other, and float them around. And then once again, with this exhibit, I was able to do sort of the same thing. And so I feel I've come to a point where I sort of feel good about sort of the blend of my art history, my painting, and my contemporary artists that I love.
So I believe the question was about process and influences and how they connect. So as I was thinking about what my influences were, I'll start with letting you know that I am primarily and have always been a figure painter. That is, my work is centered around the human body and how the body can create connections to emotional experience. And while I really love looking at the artwork from across cultures and throughout history and all the various different ways that the human body has been depicted, I really realized that I had pretty much settled on two types of art from art history that really influenced those two words that I said, emotion and rationality. The rationality that's in my art, I'm very, very influenced by the art of the Italian Renaissance and what they did when they transformed medieval art, which was usually very two-dimensional, very flat, very symbolic, into these figures that moved through two-dimensional space, that actually had a way of using body language to evoke a sense of emotion and gesture and storytelling. And they did that through really studying the human body. How are the bones and muscles connected? How do people communicate through using these theatrical gestures that we all recognize? And that period of time, they used these techniques to mostly illustrate stories from the Bible and from ancient Greek and Roman mythology. But the other influence that I have was the absolute antithesis of Renaissance classicism, and it is the work of the Expressionist artists from around World War I in Europe. And what was going on then was the artists pretty much threw out all of the classical elements of Renaissance tradition, which had had a hold on European art for 400 to 500 years. And they began to approach the body in this very raw, aggressive, exaggerated way, where they're, slashing and black and lots of really emotional, physical approach to using the body rather than a naturalistic approach. And they were using the body to tell an emotional story that had to do with not ancient history, but what was happening in the horrific time period of World War I. So those two things I see in my own artwork, and it happens in my studio because my process is also rationality and emotion. Because I'm using so much science in my work right now, I spend an awful lot of time doing both online research and research in archives, where I'm reading and I'm taking notes and I'm making little sketches and I'm making bookmarks or taking photographs. and trying to make connections between past and present, and according to the theme that I'm exploring. So I'm doing all of this research. Sometimes I will do little test paintings. I will practice my very bad left-handed calligraphy. I will lay out compositions in Photoshop. So it's very rational. I'm thinking about how all these things connect. But then when I get to the studio and I'm confronted with the messiness of physical media, the paint, the ink, the charcoal, the chalk, the experience of moving all these things around, I'm very physical with it. I'm erasing it, wiping over it, layering it in. The work itself becomes very emotional and intuitive, and all of that background knowledge is in there, but it ends up turning out like something that is the opposite of the really precise study that I had done ahead of time.
That is very interesting. Your interest in Giotto, I too have had a lot of interest and very strong emotional feeling about Giotto. And Uccello, Paolo della Francesca. But I have an interest in structure of how the pieces fit together. So how does that happen in the studio? I think we all at different times feel like we channel somebody. And I think the best way to think about it for me is, well, I may be doing puttering, doing something, and all of a sudden I see Philip Guston and the way he applied paint. And, a lot of my painting's very restrained, but I can see those marks, and then I think of what he said about brushwork, and he said, beware of it. I actually audited his course at BU. So I'm thinking about, as I'm putting different pieces of dowels together, I'm thinking about, and his name is escaping me, who took whole gymnasiums and put them up as part of what? There she goes, the Astor Gates, thank you. And these strips, they're just going to go into a painting, or I'm going to put something together like those. It just grabs me. And so my mind will go from, that drawing, well, that looks like a Mondrian, that drawing that I saw. I mean, that's 8 by 10 inches. That's exactly these lines that I'm drawing before I paint. So I'm feeling these people entering and leaving, and it isn't feeling passive towards them, it's feeling collaborative, or just borrowing or taking, or stealing, as they say, and mixing it up.
I held out as long as I could. I am not sure where my influences are. I'm always amazed when I produce my work that I actually made it. I don't know where it comes from. I think the period that was prolific that I speak of was really in 2003. I had access to a printmaking studio at BCA. I had my own studio where I could just bring stuff outside and work on the stone, or I had somebody that I made these mock-ups of things, or draw. And so I don't know that I honestly don't know who influences my work. I know the architects, there's Noguchi is paramount, but there's too many to list. They've gone from cognitive to intuitive. and it just comes from wind and goes out somewhere. So, like San Miguel, he's part of a series that was very religious at the time, and I don't know where that came from. It's just these moments of time, and I have the more material around me, the more it tells me what to do with it. And it's like that piece is actually from one piece of wood. I don't remember, it's like the diameter was like maybe 10 inches. And it was actually a sample for a project I was working on in the Adirondacks. And I had it laying around and I just decided to use it. I cut it in half. So Santa Teresa de Avila is related to San Miguel, at least according to the wood. So those are I don't have like a long lineage. It's just, I don't know where it comes from.
Can we spin off each other?
Please do.
Oh, so it's interesting when you talk about these different materials, because if you came into my studio, you would just see all these disparate materials on tables. And I mean, anything that interests me, I pick it up off the street. I save it in my car, I take it upstairs, And I'm never sure how I'm going to use it. But it's like, that's the whole vocabulary. It's there. And sometimes I'll start a piece with one piece and then, it will draw me to another piece. And so I think that instinctual way of working, intuition, that we've all talked about, is something that's a real key, And Rauschenberg, I didn't mention Rauschenberg. I mean, when I discovered Rauschenberg, I fell in love. I mean, Rauschenberg is like my favorite artist. He's just so extraordinary. In terms of his use, his imagination, do you know what I mean? I mean, he was so unfettered in terms of what he would put together. And I saw a lot of his original work in New York, and I even saw him with my daughter Larissa, who's here, at the museum, the Metropolitan Museum, at the last presentation that he made before he passed away. And even though he was in a wheelchair, do you know what I mean, and, limited, he was still an inspiration. It was one of the most momentous artists that I've ever experienced. That moment was really extraordinary. And thanks, Larissa, for being part of that with me.
It's so funny you brought up Rauschenberg, because you just set us up so nicely, Bea. Thank you. Because I wanted to use this example and sort of build off something, Michael, you said earlier about these connections across differences. When Anthony and I were putting together the list of artists we wanted to invite to participate, we were really deliberate about wanting to represent a range of artistic styles and mediums. But what's been really fascinating after we started talking to people, and now that we have the artwork, in sharing the space together, is some very, very rich visual and conceptual connections across the work. And it does feel like this web of interconnectedness is growing in the galleries. And I was going to use the Rauschenberg example because earlier I spoke about the deep influence that he's had on Anthony's work. Bea, during our studio visit, you spoke about Rauschenberg. You talked about how seeing the quarter-mile long piece cracked open this new way of working for you in terms of using solvent transfers to integrate photography onto different surfaces in your work. There's a third artist, Harlan Mack, in the exhibition, who was invited to participate in a residency on Captiva Island, which is where Rauschenberg's home and studio was for 40 years. And he told Anthony and I just how amazing that experience was for him, incredibly generative time. And so, right there's this moment of conversation happening between those three artists and maybe more in the exhibition. So that was sort of my final question for tonight for you all is, and I know you haven't seen the exhibition, so maybe this is a little unfair, but maybe there's something that's come up in this conversation that you want to build off of, or through your awareness of the other participating artists, has there been a surprising moment of connection that you found, or a resonance that you've seen between your work and someone else's work or their story?
I would say your small pieces that are brightly colored, sort of the pigmented pieces, yes. I relate to them very well. They feel like small jewels, small color field jewels. So I just looked at, when I saw the little blue one, I went, wow, that's just great. Not because I use a lot of blue, but also, just the scale, its intensity, it's quite lovely. And then I think Harlan Mack's work just brought me right back to the 1980s in the East Village, doing three-dimensional work with bright colors on them and building layers of materials and making, somewhat Stella-like pieces that just sort of floated around. So I've had a couple of connections, yes.
Well, I certainly have connected with your work, Michael. Color, and again, my work that we're showing, which is a core of my work, geometric abstraction, is also juxtaposing things that have messy lines too. And I do think that these found object things, like Samantha uses them, everybody is finding things and putting them together. And that seems very, and you Suzette, are also finding science and juxtaposing. But the word bricoleur is, a tinkerer, but it also has a lot of use in literary criticism. But I feel like I'm a tinkerer. I think we're all here tinkering around and picking things up. And I also think there's a connection with, Anthony and several people with their parents. I've made collages of my father's shoes. I get it. That is certainly the lineage there. But I wanted to just say two thoughts about lineage. I was reading Philip Glass on lineage. He really spoke directly on it. And he said he wasn't so interested in his legacy. He was interested in the lineage, the thing that was the line between him and the next generation, and what he is bringing forward. And he kept saying, "I'm going to die. I don't care what my legacy." But he wanted that, and that's where lineage comes in. We are what is a line? A point that extends, right? And we are lines to somebody else. And how do we think about that when we're in the studio? Because we're sending out those lines, networks somewhere by showing, or sometimes, I don't know, sometimes it's just by doing it. I think the other thing that I think about is Harold Bloom talked about the anxiety of influence in literature. And that is, we're talking about all these, fancy names, but we want to be one of those. And that's the struggle. That's how do you differentiate yourself? How do you, he talked about swerving away from, and that we're belated, we are coming into this late. Well, but still we've got a chance to offer something, to send out some line, that will connect with not only each other and audience, but people who are going to be working. I watch my 6-year-old granddaughter. She sees my work. Something is connecting in her mind, but not that that's important. It's just the future is very, network is really the word, because we are these little dots and the lines going out from them.
When I had looked at your work the first time, I was struck at how how the moments you look at it, there's a lot of edges. They seem constructed, but as moments pass, your work becomes incredibly soft and atmospheric, and all those lines seem to disappear and dissolve, and they feel like paintings, not constructions in that way. I like that aspect of it.
I've been struck by our conversation, actually, and just thinking about how particular artists are. Do you know what I mean? How our way of sort of being in the world and relating to the world, a kind of openness, even though we have different media. You know, it's a kind of investigative, sort of excited spirit of kind of being engaged, you know, where the world is a fascinating place. I mean, it's very interesting how I've done a lot of teaching, and I remember teaching at Tufts and Museum School during some period. There was some series on TV that was extremely depressing. It was sort of like about the end of the world. And people were talking about being so depressed about it. It wasn't as bad as what's happening in the Middle East at this point. But anyway, it was just a TV program. But what I noticed is that none of my students were depressed. I mean, they were all involved in their art making. They were channeling things and putting it into their art. And you look at everything that we've shared, do you know what I mean? And there is this continuous thread that is through everything, do you know what I mean? Of us being sort of involved in a world of intuition and experimentation and openness, and like being the 6-year-old and being willing to just, well, give it a try. Why not? Do you know what I mean? Everybody isn't like that. And I feel that it's a gift, you know, that being and having that artistic impulse is a great gift, even though it can cause challenges, let's say, on many levels, but it's a real gift.
I get lost in making. It's my happy spot. It's definitely, and I create a bubble when I do my work because I don't want anything to disturb it. As a result, I don't produce too much because I'm easily distracted, but that's okay. But I'm so honored to be part of this group because we're all making assemblages. We're, as you said, we're finding things, we're putting them in places that they hadn't been seen before, which changes how it looks and how it feels. And it's just been, it's such a great connection with all of us. And who knew? You guys did. You did. You too. But it's really extraordinary. Yeah, it's mind-blowing.
Allison, you had said that it was a little unfair to ask us what our connections were because this is the first time I've met everyone on stage except for you. But I can also see that just by our short conversation that we all have something in common, and that is this very unique and also very somehow emotionally, spiritually connected in the fact that we create something out of nothing. We take our life experiences, we take our materials, and we shape them according to what our own personal influences and quirks and history and background is. And I can't wait to actually see the artwork. I have seen the other 10 artists, I've seen their work in tiny little images on a computer screen, but I haven't actually had a chance to experience it. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one on this stage, is that when you see the work in person, it has a different resonance than when you see it in reproduction. And so I'm very much looking forward to discovering how we're all connected by seeing the actual artwork in the exhibition that you've so thoughtfully put together with Anthony.
I think it's a great place to wind down. We do want to check in with the audience to see if you have any questions or comments you'd like to share. Just one last thought I'll throw out, which is that I think the concept of creative lineage is not restricted to artists. I think we are all creative in our own right, whether you express that in the kitchen or in the garden or in your tool shed. And I mention that because there's a moment in the exhibition response area where we are inviting visitors to share stories about their creative lineage. You can do so in your own words, you can leave a picture, you can write a poem, you can leave a quotation, however you best express that. But I really hope that you think about contributing to that response area tonight or when you come back to the exhibition, because I think that's a really important part of this exhibition too, is expanding this idea of creative lineage and making it something that is universal. So even if you don't identify as an artist, you are surely creative in your own way. And I think we can turn up the lights, and Anthony has a mic out there. So just wave your hand if you have a question or comment that you'd like to put out there.
Hello, everyone. How wonderful to see you. No questions? Come on. Or comments?
Hi, thank you for this wonderful talk. This has been such an enjoyable evening. I'm Amelia. I'm the executive director here at SVAC. And I have to say, when I went through the show, I was only thinking about lineage in the past tense, and the conversation tonight really made me think about the future as well. So would love to just hear a little bit more about whether there's a recipient or a moment that you project into that lineage of your work.
I'll answer that one, thinking about why I make the work that I do, which really deals with the trauma of ecological and climate and environmental decline that people all over the world are experiencing right now. And so what I said in my introduction was that I am bearing witness to this trauma. And by bearing witness, I'm thinking about how can the images that I am making leave behind, at the very least, a breadcrumb that we experienced it very much so on an emotional level, on a physical level, on a psychological level. We are aware that it was happening. There was evidence and data for the cause, and the consequences were being felt, and that whether or not my work has a larger impact, I feel like I am throwing a line out to the future, saying that at least some of us, if not all of us, are aware of the time that we live in and the complexity of changes that are rapidly happening.
So I'll take a stab too. I've done a lot of public art pieces, some with a partner, many by myself, that are in different places in the country. And I actually have one public art piece in Japan, and they're all in stone. And every one of them invites people in. There's a sculpture called the Peace Thrones out in Bluffton, Ohio, at Bluffton College. And when they had the Dayton Peace Accord, the president actually wrote to the the attendees at the Dayton Peace Accord, invited them to come to Bluffton, which was quite close. And the sculpture is called Peace Thrones. And it came from a story that my partner at the time told me, where when there were differences of opinion in this tribe in Africa, the two people had to sit on these thrones until they came up with an answer. Same thing happens in Buddhist monasteries. If there are differences of opinion, people have to sit across from each other until somehow they find the middle space. So we made this sculpture of 3 thrones. There are discs of granite, different colors. And there's a sort of inner circle that combines them, where the people would sit. And they use it in peacekeeping exercises all the time on the campus. You know, whenever I've been able to make pieces for the public square, do you know what I mean, like this piece at Tufts, it's absolutely wonderful, you know, because people, I see people when I go to Tufts for treatments that are just standing in front of it in awe, do you know what I mean? Just, they may not get the inner meaning, or they might if they read it, but it's there, do you know what I mean? And this, you know, that we're all one. We're all one. And when people, one of the, when we had open studios last year, one of the nurses from Tufts came, which I was very surprised. She was the only person from the hospital that came. And she totally loved one piece, and it was some odd elements that I'd put together, and I called it Chance Encounter. You know, and she looked at it and she said, I've had some chance encounters in my life. So I gave it to her for half price, and it was absolutely great, and she just totally loves it. So you just never know, you know, it's a communication. And I'm here now in Vermont, and my 18-year-old granddaughter, who has come to my studio ever since she was 2 or 3, is going to use my studio tomorrow, just going and using the things that she wants to create some things for her portfolio, for her college applications. And so there are just so many ways that we provide, in a sense, do you know what I mean? Or that we offer. And we never know really the sphere of our influence, who sees what or how they relate to it, do you know what I mean? But the important thing, I think, is to share it, you know, and an opportunity like this is really extraordinary. So thank you to you and Anthony. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I think it's time to go over to the galleries. If you enjoyed tonight's conversation, as I mentioned earlier, we have programming throughout the entire run of the exhibition through the end of February 2025. So please check our website. We have Harlan Max is giving an artist talk next week on the 10th. It will be virtual, so it will be on Zoom. So you'll need to register to get access to the Zoom link, but would love to see you all virtually next week. And also, please consider joining as a member to SVAC or making a donation. It really does help us put on exhibitions like the one you're about to see and, you know, offer programming like this. So thanks in advance for any support you're able to offer. And thank you for coming.